Big Questions.
How can we trust the Bible? Welcome to Big Questions. Welcome back, guys, to Big Questions. Today we are joined by Ben Jack. He knows a thing or two about theology and Bible studies. So Ben, how can we trust what the Bible says is real and reliable? What do you do when you come across that question? How do you tackle it?
That's a really important question, because the Bible, for me as a Christian, is where I find out who God is, and in light of who God is, who am I? What is my Christian faith? How do I make sense of God and my life and living out in this world? It's my source of truth, so I want to take it seriously and I want to know that it's reliable. And there's a lot that we could talk about, but we could boil it down into 5 letters that make the acronym MARCH, just like the month of the year, M-A-R-C-H.
Okay.
And those letters stand for M, manuscripts, A, authors, R, reality, C, consistency, and H, history.
Okay. What does that mean? How do all 5 of those things show us that the Bible is reliable?
So the first thing is manuscripts. So historically, what evidence do we have that the same materials that we're looking at today relate to what was originally written back in the day? And across the Old Testament and the New Testament, and if you're not sure what that is, basically the Old Testament is the first section of the Bible that kind of is all the stuff that happens before Jesus, who's the centerpiece, the most important person in all of the Bible. Before he comes along, it's everything that happens historically leading up to him, the creation of the world and all of that stuff, and the beginnings of God working his relationship out with his people. And then eventually we arrive at Jesus coming into the world 2,000 years ago, and that's when the New Testament basically begins. And we also see then what happens after Jesus is killed on the cross, raised again back to life, and ascends back to heaven, and what happens then with his followers afterwards. And so those 2 testaments, we have various bits of manuscriptal evidence, what was originally written down. And in the very earliest parts of the Bible, it wouldn't have been written down originally. It would have been verbally spoken, what they call the oral tradition, where people would have spoken about the stories, but they wouldn't have told stories like we do today. This was their culture. They would have told stories very accurately. They wouldn't have misremembered. It was so important to pass things down with the right details. It was their version, essentially, of having writing, because they didn't have the same ability to write, or certainly the manuscripts to write down on. So as we progress through the Old Testament and the New Testament, we get more and more and more manuscriptal evidence to show us that actually what we have today is an accurate representation of what was originally written down. And actually, when it comes to the New Testament, it's not even close historically. The New Testament has more manuscriptal evidence for it than any other ancient document of its time by a long, long stretch. I mean, the closest other thing to it is probably an ancient piece of writing called the Iliad by Homer. And we have, maybe a few hundred, 400 to 600 copies of the earliest version of that, which, by the way, was written 1,000 years after it was first put down by Homer in his original story. So the earliest manuscripts we have for that are like 1,000 years after it was done, and we have maybe 400 of those copies of those. But with the New Testament, we have manuscriptal evidence that is from within the first 100 years after it was written, which again seems like a lot, but trust me, in historical terms, it's not a lot at all. And we have 2,500 at least copies of that in the original language. Once you get to other languages, you're talking about 25,000. Once you then start looking at what other people at the time were writing about the Bible and copying parts of the Bible down, then you get to about 2 million pieces of manuscriptal evidence. So we have plenty of manuscriptal evidence. Authors, what we want to do is we want to find out who actually wrote these things, because the more we know about who wrote it, the more we can tell why they wrote it, when they were writing it, where they were writing it. And what we see actually is that you have a spread of numerous authors across multiple territories around the world, across continents, across a span of 1,500 years. And sometimes people will point at the Bible and they say, well, it seems like it contradicts, or it seems like it's out of whack with itself. And it's like, hang on a second, don't forget this thing was written in a period of history where people can talk to each other on WhatsApp.
Yeah.
They were like spread by time, they were spread by distance, they didn't have a way of talking to each other. And yet these documents that were first passed through verbally and then written down later are so accurate to one another and so consistent with one another right throughout history. It is mind-blowing that these things are not just vaguely similar, but they tell one coherent story. It's the equivalent of trying to write the 7 Harry Potter books by like 40 different authors across 5 different continents across a span of 1,000 years, and expecting one to write the first book, one to write the second book, and not really know what the other person had written always either exactly, and yet still come with a coherent story that made sense. And it's like that, but like times 1,000 or probably more, like in terms of the complexity of what's going on. Reality for March. Reality, when I read it, Is it trustworthy? Does it make a difference to my life? In the reality of my life, does the things that it says match up to my experience of the world? Does the things that it says make a difference to my life? And for me, it certainly does. It makes sense of the world around me and what it tells me about the human condition. It makes sense of my life. And also, when I apply its truth to my life, the things that it promises will be true come true in my life. I'm not the same as I was before I knew Jesus, just like the Bible tells me. See, consistency, that comes back to the author's thing again. It's consistent with itself. Yes, there's some challenging bits where you're like, wow, it seems like that author's saying that and that author's saying that, and they seem different. But the more we study, the more we look into it, the more we think about it, we realize, no, this is actually consistent with itself. And finally, historically, as we look through history, does it match up to archaeology? Yes, actually more and more and more as we dig around in the dirt and we find what was going on historically. First of all, we look at the Bible and we're like, well, that doesn't really match up to history. And then we do a bit more digging in the dirt and we're like, oh, we found a new inscription on a stone that tells us, oh, King David was a real person after all. And so history is constantly learning from new archaeological evidence. And there's never been a major piece of archaeological evidence that's disproved the Bible. Quite the opposite. The more we find in the dirt, the more we realize that the Bible actually is very accurate, more accurate than we even thought it was originally.
Brilliant. That's so awesome. I love that analogy about the Harry Potter books thing. That makes so much sense in my head. So thank you so much, Ben. I've heard people say before that obviously the Bible was never written in English.
Sure.
But yet we read it in English. Does that ever affect how reliable it can be?
No, it doesn't need to. No, the Bible was originally written in Hebrew in the Old Testament and Greek with just a little bit of Aramaic here and there as well. And if we can't read those languages, we need to rely on people who can read them to translate for us, just like you might need to translate something from French into English if you want to read a French textbook, and maybe you have to do that yourself in school. So people might have a little bit of understanding of what it means to translate a sentence. Well, we have experts who can do that for us. Look at the manuscripts. What did it say? Translate it. And the reason why you might see different types of Bible with slightly different letters on them, and it reads ever so slightly differently when you read it, is because there's not always perfect agreement over exactly how you should translate something. So there's different Bible translations to show this one's translated it this way, this one's translated it this way. You might think, oh, that shows that we don't really know what it says. No, not at all. We know exactly what all the differing views are. And at some point somebody's gone, I know that it could be this one, it could be this one, and it could be this one. I think it's this one, so I'm going to put it there on the paper, but I'm also going to put a little note at the bottom to let you know that there's other ways of understanding this text. And none of those differences so change the meaning of the Bible that we need to worry about it. So our modern English translations are superb.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, Ben. We really appreciate it. If you have any questions at all, guys, about the Bible, how we can relate to it or what it means for our lives, please do get in touch and let us know in the comments if you have any more big questions that you want us to tackle.